welcome to Chronicle, a conversation about books and their importance to our world today. I'm James Xiao, and I'm joined by Sam Spieler.
Hi.
And Yad Darris.
Hey.
Today, we are discussing my choice for our mini-series on Japanese fiction. It's Kafka on the Shore by Haruki Murakami, the first half, so chapters 1 through 22. If you're following along and you don't want to hear spoilers, listen to us after you finish chapter 22. So, guys, Murakami is easily the most well-known Japanese writer in contemporary literature. He has groupies, apparently, that are called Harukists. Have the two of you read any Murakami before?
I've read a handful of his novels and a handful of his short stories, mostly from The Elephant Vanishes? An Elephant Vanishes?
The Elephant Vanishes.
Yeah, and maybe 3 or 4 of his novels.
So of the novels you've read, which one's your favorite?
The first one I read, which seems to be a lot of people's favorites, The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. I think you might have been the one to suggest that to me.
Yeah, it might have been. I mean, that's the only Murakami novel I've read, The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, and it had a big impact on me. I mean, I was in an impressionable phase of my writing life, I guess, before I went to my MFA program. So, yeah, it had a big impact on me. I still really like the novel, but I can honestly say I don't remember anything about it besides the feeling of a guy in a well and looking for a cat, I think. Right? That's like half of his novel, so that's a good guess.
Cat and a woman, right? He's
yes.
looking for a cat, but also his wife.
Yeah. What about you, Ed?
So I've read quite a few of his novels, maybe 10 or so. I started reading him when I was pretty young. I just started college, and I really got into him. So I read maybe 10 or so of his novels in a row. I was really a big fan for a while. I stopped around maybe 2006 or so. But now that I'm coming back to him with this novel, I feel like all of the things that I remember are present in Kafka on the Shore.
Yeah, he doesn't stray far from his comfort zone, I guess.
Yeah, he definitely has a style. And I know that sometimes when you have such a strong style, it can almost become self-parody. But even though he's got such a strong style, it's almost kind of something that's prone to mockery or something. It's still something that I enjoy. I've
read his 3 short story collections. Well, he has 4. I didn't read his most recent one, Men Without Women, but I read the first 3, and I like them. I didn't like them as much as the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. My sense is that he's a better novelist than a short story writer. I think he needs that space to kind of let things unfold and let things build up a bit. I think it's also hard to have that meditative tone that he strikes in a short story. It just doesn't feel complete. I don't know if you guys felt the same when you've read his short stories, or if you have read his short stories. I know, Sam, you said you did.
Yeah, that's funny. I vaguely remember you feeling differently before when you read his short stories. I remember you liking the short stories more than the novel, but maybe I misremember.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't gone back and reread them, but I do remember a lot of them feel incomplete. But I think part of it is maybe, with age, I expect something different. Like back then, maybe I thought, oh, this is great. I was really into minimalism back then. And his short stories are pretty minimalist because I think he translated Carver into Japanese, which is interesting because his style in his novels are not Carver-esque. I wouldn't say.
No, but his short stories are closer to Carver, I would say.
Yeah, yeah.
Or at least the short stories I've read, which aren't any of the recent ones.
So let's talk about Kafka on the Shore. A little bit of background. So it was published in 2002 and translated into English in 2005. The reviews were generally positive. I think all of his books were positively reviewed at that point in his career. And a lot of his fans list this novel as their favorite, or at least top three. It hits a lot of the Murakami tropes, like we talked about earlier, the missing cats and the mysterious women, supernatural powers, a lot of nighttime scenes. The structure of this is interesting. There are two plot lines which alternate by chapter. The odd chapters follow Kafka, who's a 15-year-old runaway, and he leaves his father's home in Tokyo for the town of Takamatsu on the island of Shikoku. And on this journey, it's kind of a long journey. It's 11 chapters. So a lot of things kind of happen to him. But the two important events that happen is there's an episode where he passes out and he wakes up covered in blood. And another episode where he meets a young woman and he keeps on talking about how it reminds him of his sister, and then she gives him a hand job, which also is another trope of Murakami's, like strange sex scenes. By the end of chapter 2, he's living in the library, working as an assistant to Oshimi, a transgender woman, and Miss Saiki, the library's caretaker. And then the even chapters feature, I think we're agreeing to call him Nakata, a man in his 60s who lost his memories at 10 years old because of some kind of strange, kind of supernatural incident involving a plane or a UFO. And as a result of this, he can't read, but he can talk to cats. And because of his disability, he receives a government subsidy, and he augments his income by looking for cats. And the big plot development in the first 11 chapters involving him is while he's looking for a cat, he encounters a malevolent being called Johnny Walker, who kills cats in order to consume their hearts. And Nakata kills Johnny Walker and then starts hitchhiking to Shikoku, where presumably he will meet up with Kafka. And so that's what's happening at the end of chapter 22. Nakata's going to Shikoku. We find out also that the man who Nakata kills, Johnny Walker, turns out to be Kafka's father. And then we also realize that there's some kind of psychic bond between the two of them, because when he kills Johnny Walker, he doesn't have any blood on him. When Nakata kills Johnny Walker, he doesn't have any blood on him, but Kafka is covered with blood. It's quite long. I mean, a lot of things happen, even though that's the thing about Murakami is when you read it, you feel like not a lot is happening. It does feel very meditative and slow, but things do happen.
There's a lot of important things that you didn't mention, but there's so many small important things that it would take too long to detail all of them.
Right. A lot of striking images, like the raining leeches and fish, right? Like it seems, maybe it's not important, but it's striking. So it stands out.
I think that's part of Murakami's style. As you've mentioned, there are so many things that you could talk about in the novel because there are so many details that he shares with the reader. And I think that it's difficult to point out which details are important and which aren't, but the feeling of the novel, the tone of the novel isn't really the result of any of these details, but rather the details kind of their cumulative result.
And what is the cumulative result in your mind? like at the end of chapter 22?
To me, the result of all of these details, just very broadly speaking, it's not in this novel, but in his fiction in general, it's a very meditative, thoughtful state, a very cautious state. I would say it's a state of heightened awareness where the protagonist feels more sensitive and more in tune with things going on around him, but the reader as well, I think, is also kind of more clued into subtleties.
Sam, did anything stand out to you? What were your first impressions?
I have this battle with Murakami that he's got these MacGuffins that show up throughout his books. And I always have this issue, and it happens a lot in Kafka on the Shore.
Oh, Sam, very briefly, Sam. Now, of course, I know what you mean by MacGuffin, but for the listener who might not know a MacGuffin, just explain it quickly.
Not for us. We totally know.
Sure. So a MacGuffin is a device in fiction, in storytelling, that serves just to move the plot forward and may be very important to the characters or some of the characters, but isn't necessarily important to the viewer or reader. For example, like in a pop culture reference, a famous one would be the Maltese Falcon, where the viewer doesn't really care about this object, but it is very important. It drives all of the plot of, the detective chasing it and the other people involved in this. I believe that's a Chandler story. And there's a lot of those objects throughout this book, and it's really hard to tell which ones are important, which ones will have meaning by the end of the book, and which ones just, like, for example, the leeches falling from the sky. Are those important? No idea. So I have this struggle with a lot of Murakami's writing with those MacGuffins.
I think we can get into this a little bit more later, but my response to that would be important in what sense? I feel like they all are important in different senses. I don't think that they all have the same weight in terms of moving the plot along or in terms of the overall theme of the novel, but they have their own importance in different ways in terms of establishing tone.
Yeah, I guess it's world building, I suppose, but what kind of world building? I think we will get into this a little later when we talk about the details a little bit more, but I've just always struggled with how deep should I look into these things.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never really had an issue with those elements of his books because it's taken together. Taken individually, I see what you mean. But because he has so many of these kind of stray images, they kind of just sort of work together as like a patchwork quilt of sorts. It just kind of builds this kind of this world, where strange things happen and they seem to have significance, but they actually don't. I mean, that's kind of, to me, what makes him interesting, I guess.
Because they're called attention to, because they are seen as strange things. Like Johnny Walker, for example, why is he Johnny Walker? That might be something based on Nakata's... you know what? I take that back. I was about to say that might be something to do with Nakata's weird way of thinking, the way he got hit on the head. Or not hit, the way he got beaten into unconsciousness as a kid and now can't read or write. But that actually, there's something that happens later, past chapter 22, that disproves that. So, there's details like that I don't know why it comes up. Why Johnny Walker?
I mean, he identifies himself as Johnny Walker, right?
What I mean is, it's not Johnny Walker, though.
Right.
And that if this is Kafka's father, if this is actually Kafka's father, how does that intersect? How does that come together? And we aren't given any answers, and maybe that's the point, but that's a very strange point.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sort of mystery aspect of the book that I enjoy, actually. I don't feel frustrated by it. I think, I mean, I don't spend a lot of time wondering, like, why is it Johnny Walker, I guess. But the fact that we don't know who he is, and it's just such a strange label, to like call someone in a book Johnny Walker. It's just so strange, very postmodern. That I just kind of take it and roll with it, I guess. I don't find myself trying to find extra meaning behind it.
Yeah, this is kind of what I was referring to before with the tone of the novel. When there's a lot of signifiers in a text that we don't know what they're referring to exactly, it creates the overall tone of not knowing. There's a...
Yes.
You suspect meaning, but you can't pinpoint it. And I think that tone of not knowing exactly what's going on is desirable for certain readers and perhaps not desirable for you, Sam.
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, I'm enjoying it, but yeah, it definitely rubs me in an odd way, and I don't know how to respond.
I think we can get back to how this novel rubs Sam in just a couple minutes. Why don't we have a break now?
Welcome back. Yed, would you like to start us off with a question?
Yeah, this is related to what we were talking about before the break. What I would like to talk about is the relationship between the characters in the novel and all of the unusual things that happen in their world. We see it in Kafka on the Shore, of course, but it's a trait of almost all of Murakami's novels. They've been called magical realism, which is a genre where elements of the world are supernatural, but most of the world is otherwise realistic. And that kind of fiction, the attitude the characters have towards the magic in their world is peculiar. They might acknowledge these things are unusual, but they aren't stupefied the way that we might be if something magical or supernatural happened in our world. Now, here what I'm thinking about in Kafka on the Shore are the news reports that we talked about the raining fish and the raining leeches, or Oshima's reaction when Kafka told him that he believed he was the murderer of his father, even though he was in a different part of the country. To me, I would say that these events, they don't dissolve the limits of rational thought for these characters so much as they expand them. It seems that in their minds, the world isn't divided between possible and impossible, but instead between possible and newly possible. In 2004, just before the English translation of Kafka on the Shore was published in the US, Murakami was interviewed about how, unlike other magical realist fiction authors, his characters sometimes call attention to the unusual things, and they note it. And his response was, "Well, I think it's my honest observation of how strange the world is. My protagonists are experiencing what I experience as I write, which is also what the readers experience as they read." Murakami compared himself to Kafka or Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and he notes that his stories are more about the contemporary, postmodern experience. In the classical kind of magical realism, the walls in the books are real. If something is fake in my fiction, I like to say it's fake. Later on in the interview, he also says that he's telling the readers that it's just a story, it's fake. He says, we're living in a fake world, but we find reality in this fake world. So our stories are the same. We are walking through fake scenes, but ourselves as we walk through those scenes are real. The situation is real in the sense that it's a commitment. It's a true relationship. In your opinion, how do you think his fiction relates to our fake postmodern experience?
So I read that more as the events in the book are fake, but the emotions are real, and we in this real world relate to them in a very real way. He says that he writes it and it's real to him. It wouldn't serve us as the reader if he treated it as if it was fake to him. He's trying to get into the head of the protagonist, so it has to be real to him. But as he points out, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's magical realism was more about life in a fantastical world, the way he saw Columbia. And Kafka was more absurdist, drawing from like the absurdity of life by taking it to extremes. But Murakami's style is more puzzling. Like I was saying before, the MacGuffins don't have the same kind of meanings that they might in Garcia Marquez. So in Garcia Marquez, a character is always signaled, his approach is always signaled by these yellow butterflies, or maybe when someone gets shot, his mother knows about it because his blood trickles down the street past all these obstacles and magically finds its way to his mother. That kind of thing, those have weight to them. Whereas here, we have things falling from the sky that don't normally fall from the sky, and characters remark on them, and then that's it. We move on. And I don't know what that weight is. Maybe it's fitting in that postmodern nihilistic sense, in that it doesn't make sense to either the characters or the reader.
That's kind of the most important part, or the most interesting part for me of his remarks, is that he says it's a observation of how strange the world is. And what I get by that is not the world of the fiction, but the world that we live in, our real lives. He says that his protagonists are experiencing what he experiences when he writes. And later on, he says that we're living in a fake world. We find reality in this fake world, so our stories are the same. So besides the world of fiction, the world of the novel, what do you think he means to say about our reality nowadays? He's talking about the postmodern experience.
See, I don't want to say anything. I guess. Well, the thing is, my answer is a non-answer in a way. Like I've thought about this quite a bit. I think he literally means what he literally said. Like I don't think he means anything beyond that. I definitely see it as a trait of postmodern fiction, right? And so that's definitely there, but that doesn't actually tell us anything, right? If you say this fiction is postmodern, you don't actually say anything about our world. You're saying something about that piece of work, right? Just like if I say this fiction is realist, you're describing the fiction, but you're not ascribing necessarily any meaning about the world to that book, right? So here you're saying he's talking specifically about the world. I don't know. I really can't say there's any extra meaning in my mind. Like when I read a statement, or when I listen to you say the statement, I just think, well, he feels alienated from the world. I think you see that in a lot of his interviews as well. He's just kind of a loner dude. And a lot of times, like when I hear him talk, he just talks about how his personal experience of the world is very strange, which lends itself to the writing. Like he talks about why he uses the same kind of imagery all the time. And he says he has this kind of obsession with ears or cats, right? Like, so when he says like he says our experience is a fake postmodern experience, I think what he's saying is he feels the world in that way. Like, it feels artificial. But I don't know if we can ascribe anything beyond that. Like, he's not, a prophet.
I don't think it's prophecy necessarily. I think that he's pointing to something that it's not an individual experience, but rather something that he at least presumes is a shared experience of people living in contemporary society. I think that he's trying to demarcate his experience from the experiences of previous writers like Marquez and Kafka. I think it has more to do with the way people feel about living in worlds of simulation and living in worlds of representation, and also living in worlds where foundational truths like objectivity and law and truth are called into question. And I think that kind of postmodern experience that we feel if we are sensitive to those issues is represented in the novel in a certain way. Not necessarily just his own experience, but the reader's experience is represented in the novel.
I have a clarifying question to ask you. So you said earlier that he contrasts this book to other magical realist books where, supernatural events occur, but it's otherwise realistic, and that in that kind of fiction, the characters have a peculiar attitude toward magic, right? Like, they are not surprised by it. So are you surprised by characters reacting to this in this novel? Is that what you mean? That you find it surprising that the characters in Murakami's work do actually acknowledge its strangeness?
Well, they find it surprising. So the leeches falling from the sky, they remark on it as being unusual.
Right, and I'm saying, Iyad, are you saying that you find that surprising? Like, it stands out to you?
No, what I mean here is that there are 3 points of view. There's, first of all, our point of view, where if these things happened in our world, I think we would react differently from what happens in Murakami's fiction. Then there's the point of view inside of Murakami's fiction where they do react and they do think that these things are unusual, but it's still much less of a reaction than we would expect in our own lived reality. And then the third point of view is the reaction that we would find in what he calls the classical magical realist fiction, where people experience these magical things as being commonplace. They don't react to it very strongly at all. So I think he has shown a difference between his fiction and classical magical realist fiction, but I still don't think that his fiction is paralleling our own reaction if these things happened in our real world.
Right, it's still muted. Muted reaction.
Is there, I guess my question is, I didn't really notice any kind of outsized reaction to these strange events. Like, after Kafka tells Oshima about, the whole blood situation, Oshima's reaction wasn't, it wasn't out of the ordinary, right? It wasn't like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened. It was like, that's stuff like that happens. Point. Yeah, it's quite. I don't see what Murakami is saying. I don't actually see much of a difference, to be honest, in between what he says he's doing in his fiction and what other magical realist writers are doing. I think there is like some reaction, but it's quite muted. Like when the fish or like when the leeches rain down. I think that's maybe the strongest reaction, where the driver says, imagine that, leeches raining, something like that, and he's just like, that would never happen, so you get skepticism, right? Is that the leeches?
Right. That's the point, though. The skepticism is what makes this different from quote unquote classical magical realism. And
Right.
when I mentioned in Garcia Marquez, when you have a specific character that's always preceded by yellow butterflies, no one remarks about the butterflies. That's just a character attribute. It just happens, and it's very natural.
Mm-hmm.
The supernatural and natural exist on the same plane, and that there's no comment to be made about those things that would be strange to us. So here, it's still remarked on as being strange. So it's not fully magical realist, but their reactions, the characters' reactions, are not as strong as what our reactions probably would be, is what...
I think I agree with you, Sam. This is what I meant before, where I think in our minds there are things that we conceive of as impossible. And if those things happened, we would be dumbstruck, like we would just be there with our mouths open, but we wouldn't know how to react to it because we see things as scientifically and logically impossible because we have this very postmodern worldview, which is very determined by science in a way. Even though we reject the underpinnings of science, on the other hand, we still believe very faithfully that leeches will never fall from the sky. And if that happened, we wouldn't know what to do. But in Murakami's world, I think the world is not possible or impossible, but possible and newly possible. And when something new happens, their reaction is, oh, look at that. I didn't know that could happen, but I guess it can.
Well, I'm just thinking, what I'm thinking about is Miyazaki, Miyazaki's films, which apparently Murakami doesn't watch and has no interest in watching. Is that in the same interview that you guys read?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in Miyazaki, that also kind of happens, but it's much more magical realist in his definition, like the way he defines it, where it's more accepted. So the reason why I bring it up is I'm trying to decide if I can. I'm trying to figure out if this is like a Japanese attitude that we are not privy to, like this attitude toward what is real and what is supernatural and where the boundaries begin and end. And I'm not like a Japanophile, if that's what they're called. I'm not really into Japan. But as far as I understand, there is this belief that objects in Japan have souls, right?
Right, kami.
And so they all have spirits of some sort.
Everything is a minor god of some sort.
Right. So, I mean, if you do have that as part of your culture, then you would expect certain oddities to happen. And you would react to it with perhaps muted surprise, but not shock the way we would. So I guess I'm saying... like I know what you mean when you're quoting him. It's hard for me to ascribe it to postmodernism, I guess, because I look at it as much more of a cultural difference, and I think he tries to make it into a postmodern difference, but I find it hard to believe him.
To go off on a little bit of a tangent here, what I'm kind of pointing to here is this idea from sociology developed by Max Weber. It's called disenchantment, a worldview where scientific thinking and logical thinking have robbed our worldviews of the experience of magic or the belief in things outside of our worldview that can coexist with the way that we conceive the world. And I think that's really what we see as a distinction between Murakami's world and our world, is that our world is very disenchanted, but there is still a feeling of enchantment in Murakami's fiction, where they understand something of the world, but they are willing to admit that there's part of their world that they don't understand completely yet, and there's room for expansion.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually what I like about Murakami, why I like his novels. Um, there are writers in English who do this. Like I think Chabon does that, Michael Chabon. I look at it like it's enchantment, but I also look at it as a sense of wonder at possibility. Like it doesn't have to be necessarily supernatural, but if you have this kind of scientific underpinning, things become very sterile and clinical. I don't feel that when I read Murakami. I don't feel like it's very sterile. I think there is this possibility for anything to happen. Just like when I read Chabon, I think there's a possibility for anything to happen. So, yeah, I mean, to your point, I totally agree. I wonder then, like, is that a cultural difference? Like, is that what you ascribe it to?
I would say no. I think that this is part of being modern or postmodern, is this worldview that life as we know it is demarcated into possible and impossible, and we understand things through a scientific method, and the idea that things could happen because of supernatural beings like gods or spirits, it exists in the past. It's part of the fabric, the basic level of Japanese society in terms of the past, but I don't think that there's real influence on the way modern Japanese people or people around the world really conceive their identity or their reaction to the world nowadays. I think nowadays most people are very scientific.
Yeah, I guess agree. Well, I haven't read a lot of Japanese novels. What little I know about their culture, their media, tells me that it's not really a feature of their fiction. That they still have a lot of movies and shows that demonstrate that there is the difference between possible and impossible. And Murakami kind of stands on his own in this respect. Not that he's completely unique, probably, but that usually the things I've seen, characters in a world where the impossible happens, they do take note of it, or there's a logic to it in that world building, at least. Whereas here, there isn't really much logic to the world building a lot of times. Things just happen. There's a plane, or there's a UFO rather, and then some kids fall down, but that's never explained, and it's not even really important. It turns out that that's not even the reason why Nakata is the way he is, we find out. So
I have a question about that, Sam, because you brought that up before. I'm only up to chapter 22, so I can't speak to what happens afterwards. But I'm not entirely right. But I'm not entirely sold on his beating being the cause of his brain damage.
Sure. Well, then I would ask, why do both of those things exist? That kind of goes to what I was saying earlier about there being logic and explanation, where maybe I have a feeling that by the end of the book, there won't be any explanation. We're just going to have this character who is this way, maybe because of the beating, maybe because of this supernatural thing that happened to all his classmates, but who knows? Is it important? I don't know.
Well, I have two questions for you. My first question is rather brief, which is, do you think this is problematic? Because I can just quickly say, I don't think it's problematic.
I don't think it's I think that's a strong word. I don't think it's problematic. I don't think everything needs to be tidy all the time, but I do think my brain wants it to be a little bit more meaningful than this happened, but it has nothing to do with the plot.
My second question is, maybe it's not really a question, more of a transition, because this seems to go toward Iad's question, right? Which is like how his fiction relates to our postmodern experience. This is what I would say, like exactly what you described, which is that, in our kind of postmodern experience where individuals are largely powerless, these occurrences occur, right? Like things happen where we don't know why they happen, but they just happen. There's maybe no explanation. Some person eats a bat or didn't eat a bat, and suddenly people are dying around the world, right? Like it's absurd in a way, but it's what life is like.
Yeah, I guess so. But those have consequences. Even though there's misinformation and strange things happen. Maybe a bat being eaten or not being eaten has not directly contributed to my life yet, but it's still something that could be explained by someone somewhere. Whereas here we just have some leeches fall from the sky and they seem like they're important, but it seems to be that they actually aren't in retrospect, and they have nothing to do with anything.
What I would say to that, Sam, is it seems like you have a very modern or rationalist worldview, which is opposed to the way that this novel seems to work, because, you're saying that, some people believe the wrong thing. It's possible to know the right thing, and it's possible to know truth, capital T truth, and maybe some people are wrong, but eventually it will be possible for some people to be right. And I think that the inclusion of all of these things that might seem tangential or don't seem to amount to anything is actually the point, that Nakata knows something, his former teacher knows something, the inspectors who interviewed the teacher know something, but all of these people have different shades of understanding of the same thing, and none of them separately are right.
Yeah, and so that's my best answer, Iad, to your question, which is this is how I see his fiction relating to our, quote, fake. I'm not satisfied with the word fake. I think artificial is probably better, right? Because fake is used in the interview, but it seems like it's artificiality. It seems random, like artificial and random. That's how I see it relating.
Yeah.
Yeah, fake does have a pejorative sense to it. I think artificial might be a little bit more accurate. I don't think that he means fake in the sense that it's created with the sense that it should deceive other people, but our experience of the world lacks the sense of authenticity that perhaps people in the past had when they were experiencing their worlds.
I think that sense of authenticity comes from belief. Right? Like we believe God created this, and so it feels real to us. But if we don't have that, if God is dead, then it feels less real to us.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. Our foundation of meaning and our foundation of significance is very much shaken these days, and I think that that's what contributes in part to this sense of artificiality. In spite of all of these supernatural things that we'd been talking about, the mundanities of the world of the novel are equally present. There are as many Mazda Miatas and second helpings of rice in this novel as much as there are talking cats or teleporting murderers. In the same interview I mentioned earlier, when he was talking about writing so many details, Murakami said, "I like details very much. Tolstoy wanted to write the total description. My description is focused on a very small area. When you describe the details of small things, your focus gets closer and closer, and the opposite of Tolstoy happens. It gets more unrealistic. That's what I want to do. The closer it gets, the less real it gets. That's my style." What do you think is the relationship between detail and realism? Do you think that the presence of all of this detail in the protagonist's mind indicates something about the protagonist's worldview?
So I pulled out my Burroway today, back from my creative writing days, and she talks about how in writing realist fiction, you want concrete, significant details. So his details, I think, are definitely concrete. They definitely appeal to your senses. But I think where he kind of subverts that is it is not significant. So sometimes he goes at length to describe something, and you might even feel a bit frustrated because you think, why is he describing this? I can't ascribe any meaning to it. I think it's because it's not significant. So it creates this feeling of unreality. It's in a way like the opposite of what we're taught to do in creative writing, by creative writing textbooks. Like when we're taught to write realist fiction, we are taught to write concrete details because there's some kind of abstract idea that's attached to it. So that's what I think is interesting about it here. So to your question, the relationship between detail and realism, that's why I think a lot of times that's what adds to his stories or novels adds to that feeling of unreality or supernatural, adds some kind of supernatural veneer, because he describes things in so much detail, but like Sam mentioned earlier, there's no significance, and then you just think, well, what's going on here? Like I don't understand it, which is interesting. Like I find that interesting, and I think it adds to the postmodern worldview.
I had trouble with this. I kind of thought about a tangential piece of it. One of the things that jumps out at me about Murakami, and I feel sometimes I'm judging too harshly, is that some of his details will just be like, James, you mentioned he's got a fascination with ears. So there's some scenes where he talks about people's ears quite a bit. But then he also has details like brand names or musician names. And some of those make sense in context. And some of those, I don't know. And maybe that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about significance. But I feel like there maybe is some significance. So, for example, we've got Mazda Miatas, which that does tell me something. That tells me that this character likes to drive fast, but it's not an impossibly expensive car. It's still a Mazda. It's a lower end sports car, something that a librarian at an obscure library could afford. But then why does Kafka listen to Cream and Duke Ellington specifically? Is it because he's a 15-year-old that doesn't have access to a whole bunch of music in the early 90s? Prince is at least more contemporary. He brings up Prince. I don't want to read too much into it, but it does start to feel name-droppy. Or is it just, does he just pick these and the Beatles and Led Zeppelin because these are music of rebellion, or because it's universally recognized? I don't know.
It seems like what you two are talking about is the way that these details contribute to the reader's experience of the novel, But what I'd like to more focus on is what the details contribute to the worldview of the protagonist, because these are stories that are told from a first-person point of view. So when we read these things, we also have to imagine that the protagonist is thinking about these things. So why is the protagonist spending so much time thinking about these things?
Do you have an example of the details that spring to
Sure.
mind?
So when Kafka is driving to Oshima's cabin, he spends quite a bit of time thinking about how Oshima drives and how he handles the car. Why is that sort of thing on his mind at this moment, especially when so many unusual things have happened, especially when he would assumably be a little bit freaked out by the thought that he woke up in the woods and he couldn't remember several hours and he was covered in blood?
Do you think that's also MacGuffin-ish? That it's a way for them to start talking about life and death and how Oshima drives this way because he wants to die quickly if he's going to die. He doesn't want it to be slow. Is this just a way of moving the conversation forward?
Okay, well, do you think that all of these kind of digressions into detail are in the novel for the same reason? Are they all there to make you understand some point of the world of the novel, or are they there for another reason? Because Murakami's quote says that his style is to make things unrealistic. The closer it gets, the less real it gets. Why do you think he wants it to be unreal in that way? Why is that his style that he's chosen for his fiction?
Doesn't someone mention a red herring in the book?
Yeah, that happens when the two feminist kind of bureaucrats come to the library to criticize him.
That's right. I feel like there might be a lot of red herrings in this book, where MacGuffin red herrings, if that's a thing, where we have these signifiers that don't actually signify much of anything, such as Johnny Walker. It's not important that it's Johnny Walker. That's not what you're supposed to take from it, and yet it's still Johnny Walker. It's like a distraction, but I don't. Yeah, to your question, I don't really know what to make of that. Why call attention to something only to say it's not important?
So yeah, your question is, like, what does this indicate about their worldview? Do you think this indicates anything about the character's worldview?
Well, I think that it does, in the sense that it seems distinct from the way that I imagine I would react if these things happened to me in my real life. If these things happened to me, if I woke up in the woods and I couldn't remember the past hours of my life and I was covered in blood, I would probably be thinking about that nonstop for the next several days, because that seems to me to be a very unusual and supernatural occurrence, and it would fill my mind. But it seems like the characters in this world, the world of the novel, have minds that are more fluid. They move from one thing to the next very quickly. And it seems to indicate some difference between the way that these characters react and the way that real people would react.
This is something that people often criticize Murakami for, which is that his characters all seem the same. Mm-hmm. And I think because they seem the same, because they all have this kind of quality where they're kind of untethered, right? Their mind wanders.
Yeah, I would agree.
They all seem similar because of that, right? So I find it difficult to say, whether to say definitively any that signifies or indicates anything about the worldview, because I feel like all his characters act like that. So it's hard to say that this is a defining characteristic about a character. I think it's more of a defining characteristic, not of the character, but of his style.
Yeah, but wouldn't you say it's fair to say that maybe all of Murakami's protagonists have the same worldview? Maybe he intends for them to be similar types of people who react to the world in similar ways.
I guess so, in the sense that a lot of times it's kind of Seinfeldian, right? Like it's about nothing. Like I feel like it's about nothing. They're like this because they are. I don't think there is much significance. It's similar to, why the idea of like why even have these details in the first place. I don't think there is much significance, but that's my reading into it. Do you think there is significance?
Well, I don't think it's significance in terms of the plot or the world of the novel, but rather it's significant to me in terms of the way that these people live in their world as a parallel, an inexact parallel, but a parallel nonetheless to our experience of our world, in that there is a sense of unreality in the fiction because these characters don't react, they don't have a psychology that mirrors our own. So their world also feels unreal. And I think that this goes back to the previous topic about the postmodern experience and the sense of unreality that we have sometimes in our own experience. Now, I don't know how much we can say that's present in Murakami's mind when he's writing, but it is my take on it.
I think, after having this conversation just makes me think that he is... he's not a realist writer, but he's pretending to be one, which is the magic trick, because his books do feel very rooted, and they feel rooted because of the details. But the way he executes his storytelling, he makes everything seem unreal. And so that's interesting to me.
All right, so building off of your question, Ed, a little bit, Murakami's novels often deal with underworlds, with warped versions of reality, kind of like Alice stepping through the looking glass to a world where everything is reversed. Identity and perversions of one's identity specifically play a large role in this book. Early on, Oshima describes the myth of people's two halves splitting apart, forced to wander the earth to find their other half. We can tell there is a special link between Nakata and Kafka, even if we don't fully understand it yet. Nakata kills a cat torturer while Kafka wakes up covered in blood, discovering later his father has been murdered, and he suspects he himself, Kafka, is the cause, even though he is impossibly far away to do so. My question is, can we extrapolate Japanese identity politics from this text? What is Murakami saying about identity? And I think there's a larger and a smaller scale here, and I'd like to start on the smaller scale first. What is happening in the text? We have two halves of a person longing to reunite. Perhaps Nakata and Kafka are one in a way, though we have yet to discover their real connection. In fact, Nakata and Kafka have their own internal identity struggles, the former losing a great deal of cognitive function after the incident when he was 10 that we talked about earlier, and then losing his ability to speak with cats after the Johnny Walker incident, while Kafka runs away from home on a sort of self-discovery mixed maybe with the search for his mother and sister, a search for his real place. We also have Oshima's identity and body politics, or as he puts it, my body is physically female, but my mind's completely male. And we also have Miss Psyche, who has her own identity split, though that comes more into focus in chapter 23 and beyond. What do you think about the role of identity in this novel?
I think in this novel, identity emerges as one of the major themes in terms of a larger theme of responsibility. And I think I can't really articulate it. I don't have the idea fully formed in my mind, but I think that one of the themes of responsibility is that we have a responsibility and a duty to others, not only in terms of what we ourselves do, but in terms of our relationship to others and our society. So I think that this kind of doubling or paralleling of people like Nakata and Kafka is there to represent this theme in a way.
I like that a lot. I think also on a more craft-oriented level that this is the plot of the book, right?
Sure.
That they're all searching for something that's missing. And I think it's really important that this is in the book, because without this, there's really no story at all. Like, all the characters have this yearning for some completion, some sort of completion. Which, I mean, you might say about every book, but it's more in the forefront in this book. So I think that's what I like about it. They're all thematically linked, like you had said earlier. But what I like about it is the fact that this is the driving force of the novel, and it keeps me reading.
Building off of that, I've noticed in a lot of his books, there's no tidy ending. The resolution is not a true resolution. Do you think there will be resolutions to these questions that he's raising about identity? Do you think they'll find their other halves, or do you think that anything concrete will happen?
Well, I think that he's raised the stakes in the viewer's mind, because not the viewer, the reader's mind. We can imagine the eventual meeting of Kafka and Nakata, and we're kind of encouraged to think of them as kind of two parts of the same thing. And they're traveling close to each other, and they're kind of in pursuit of each other. It's kind of like a chase scene in that way, where we imagine finally, when they finally meet, something is going to happen. Something monumental and significant is going to happen. I feel if in the novel that they never encounter each other, I will feel a little bit underwhelmed. Maybe not underwhelmed, but I will feel unsatisfied in a way, because I feel like we've been built up to expect something interesting to happen.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to this idea of meeting your other half, I am looking forward to them meeting, like Kafka and Nakata meeting, but I don't think there will be any kind of... The best way I can put it is like when magnets meet, where they kind of smack together and complete each other. Like, I don't expect that, because that kind of tidiness is not what I would expect from this kind of postmodern novel. The other thing I want to say about this is there's a story by Murakami. I don't know if you guys have read it, because I don't think it's in any of his collections. It's called The 100% Perfect Woman. Have you guys ever read it?
The name sounds really familiar. I think so.
It's really short. And in my younger and more single days, I would read that to every woman I was dating. But it's very short. And I really like it. I mean, it's about a person who meets their 100% perfect woman, and he loses his memory, and then or they both do. The woman, I think it's the woman who suggests that they have a test of their perfection, and they decide to split up and see if they can find each other again. And then they end up losing their memories, and then they end up passing each other in the street, and they don't recognize each other. But it goes to this kind of idea of completion. Like, I think that's what Murakami thinks about this idea, that people are always looking for something that's missing. And you really see it evident in this book. So the reason why I'm very interested in this question is this reminds me of this story that was a big part of my life when I was younger and more single.
Well, that'll be interesting to see then if his attitude towards that changes, where at the end, I don't remember that story very well. It's been a long time since I read it, but it sounds like the meaning of that is that, yeah, maybe you do have another perfect half, but just because you found that person doesn't mean you're entitled to that person, doesn't mean that you're bound to find each other again if you split up.
Yeah.
Whereas here, I don't know if it'll be that clean even.
Yes. Yeah, that story is very clean, which is why it's not like from a literary point of view, it's problematic. It's not really a story even. But
kind of a concept.
Yes. Yeah. It's a short. It's flash fiction because it's very short.
Well, cool. All right. But now how about on a larger scale? We also have two halves of a nation in need of reconciliation, or at least that is one of the things I'm reading into it. Not only with the two truck driver conversations, but also a split between what is reported and what is factual. In the case of Nakata's elementary school teacher, who must deal with her class collectively falling unconscious, maybe metaphor, but who hides the fact that just prior, she had flown into a frenzy and beat Nakata into the ground, most likely contributing to his damaged cognitive functions after his coma. In fact, this is one of several sudden violent breaks that characters experience from their normal placid selves, such as the teacher versus Nakata versus Johnny Walker, and Kafka, presumably, versus his father. I also read part of an interview with Murakami, this one from 1996, in which he discussed being drawn to the West and then back to Japan. He says that eventually, after living abroad for years, he felt he should be more directly involved with Japan and take political responsibility, as he put it, which he then clarified with the key being to face our history, and that means the history of the war. And the reason I bring this up is because it immediately reminded me of Nakata's exchange with Hoshino, the truck driver. In chapter 22, Nakata offhandedly remarks that the last time he saw the sea was as a child, when American soldiers occupied Japan. To which Hoshino replies, "Come on, Japan was never occupied by America." And this is just a little bit after his previous driver expressed confusion over there having been a war at all. Can we read further into this? Even while Japan has apologized for many things it did leading up to and during World War II, there's a significant faction of its citizens, some of them prominent and vocal figures, who deny any wrongdoing, or further deny the occurrence of any war crimes, such as the Nanjing Massacre. I don't think I'm pulling this out of nowhere, especially considering that I've read about Murakami's fascination with World War II and the Manchurian conflicts that led up to it. What do you think about this split?
For me, I think that it's an interesting idea. I'm not sure if the first part of your question really corresponds in my mind with the second part of your question. I think that this kind of national responsibility is connected to the theme that I had mentioned earlier, where we have a responsibility to each other even though we're not the same person. Collective action exists as something, I think, in this novel that people need to take responsibility for. So even though perhaps one part of Japanese society is unaware or prefers to be unaware of the war crimes that Japan committed during World War II, the fact that they personally didn't commit these things and they didn't actually even know about it, as the case may be, doesn't necessarily excuse them from responsibility. So I think that responsibility could be connected to this question in that way.
I can follow your reading, Sam, of this. Like, I see what you mean, and I can see that reading in the book. My only reservation, I think, is it's pretty neat and tidy when so much of the book isn't. So much of the book is much more you get a lot more strands in other parts of the book where you can't get the meaning. So that would be my only reservation.
There seems to me to be collective identity and individual identity seem to be really big themes in Japan, more so than I would say here in the U.S. I feel like that's part of why I brought this up, is that it definitely feels like it's reaching for some, I don't know, juxtaposition between the two, that taking things that happen on an individual level as well as things that happen on a collective level and the rewriting of those things.
One aspect of the book that I thought was interesting was that the main characters are quite passive. They don't seem to have much agency, right? They kind of just float on from one place to the next. But every time they reach a place, they are helped by kind strangers, which seems odd. But I don't have a problem with it. It's just something that I've noticed where there's that passivity, but then they're always kind of assisted, so that it seems, I guess what I'm saying here is like the characters all seem very passive, but collectively they do actually help each other, and collectively the book moves forward because of kind actions from others in the book. Did you guys notice that?
I did notice that, and I think that it does feel unreal in a sense, and unreal in a negative sense, at least in my mind, that we see people who are in remarkable situations behaving in a very passive way, and we don't see them suffering or having any sort of negative consequence. And that to me feels very artificial in a way that I don't respond to well. But at the same time, I can also see that the fact that other people are there willing to help them, even if they're not acting to help themselves, is perhaps what makes the events of the novel worth noting. Like, it's not necessarily Murakami saying that this is the way the world works, but rather the reason why this story is worth paying attention to is because people were helping each other in this particular situation.
I think that goes along also with, we haven't talked about it, but the Oedipal myth that this is kind of subverting and dealing with. I mean, the people that help Kafka, two of them specifically, tie into this Oedipus myth that is still unfolding in the book. But where Kafka's father, I think Kafka uses the word curses him with this, well, I guess this myth that he's going to kill his own father and that he's going to sleep with his mother and his sister. And we've already met the two people that he's supposedly going to sleep with. He's already slept with his sister, I suppose.
Yeah, we don't know for sure if she's her sister.
Right. We don't know that for sure. We also don't know if Miseki is his mother, but we're treating it's a theory. We're treating it as this idea, as part of this myth.
See, that's a conclusion that you've drawn that I wouldn't necessarily have myself. I do think that Miseki is significant in ways that we don't know yet, but I didn't consider her a maternal figure at all.
Yeah, I might be getting ahead of us a little bit, unfortunately.
Oh, spoiler alert, spoiler alert.
Ruined it for all of us.
But he does talk about that myth several times leading up to this, so it's not out of nowhere.
Yeah, and I think that one aspect, I guess going back to what I was saying before, where the characters seem very passive, but on the whole, they are kind of helped along by, I want to say, Japanese society. it seems to be quite affirming, you know, which is like a counterpoint to the, I mean, quite horrific Johnny Walker, you know, eating the cat's heart in order to play, is it a flute? Some kind of soul flute. Like that scene is very, it's like a horror scene from a, like perhaps a Stephen King novel. I mean, I don't have an issue with it. I think, you know, this kind of genre mashing is fine. But I guess my point is that this kind of affirmative communal message that moves the plot along is a counterpoint to Johnny Walker, who's like a disruptive force. And I thought that was interesting. So in terms of like, we kind of have this yin and yang kind of, you know, where you have this very malevolent force, and then you have Nakata, who's just trying to help, you know, people find cats. You know, they're very opposite. So it kind of goes to your point of like two halves. Like this is not necessarily two halves that are meant to be together, maybe, but that kind of juxtaposition of the two of them, I think, is very interesting. You have a character who knows a lot, seemingly, who knows more than most people know about the world and is very evil. And then you have Nakata, who's very simple, doesn't know a lot, but with his limited knowledge, he's trying to do good, like do simple goodness.
We also have, I mean, you brought up the fact that we have several characters who just kind of bumble along. Kafka at least knows where he wants to go. He has an idea of where he wants to go, and he heads specifically to Shikoku and checks out this library. But for Nakata, after killing Johnny Walker, he knows he has to leave, but he doesn't really have a clear image of where he has to go. I don't think we're given a specific reason why he heads west. He just heads west.
Yeah, there's that kind of feeling of fate in the book,
yes,
where people do things. They seem to be kind of pulled along.
Well, this is one of the reasons why I brought up the Oedipal myth, is because that is all about fate, about how you can't escape it. And I'm interested in seeing how that unravels here, and whether that is only something that concerns Kafka, or how is Nakata going to fall into that, if at all.
I want to briefly talk about the hand job.
Yeah, you do.
Because it goes along with this. He is incredibly passive, right? He even, he doesn't know what to say.
Yeah, he asks her if it would be okay if he imagined her naked.
Yes, which is incredibly passive, right? Like, not just passive, like, oh, you're going to molest me passive, but like, while you molest me, can I, you know? Mm-hmm. I thought that was interesting. I think, you know, he's often criticized for writing these, I guess going back to my word of the day, problematic, like these problematic sex scenes. Mm-hmm. This does feel problematic to me. I don't know if it felt problematic to you guys.
I don't feel like it's inauthentic. I'm just imagining myself at 15. I feel like the significance that the hand job has to him, it matches my own experience of my teenage years. Like, if I
with your sister,
not my sister, but if I had met any woman on the bus and then I went to her apartment and she offered to give me a hand job, it would have been a big deal. It would have been something to think about for a long time. I don't know, maybe your own teenage years were much more exciting than mine, but that would have been a monumental event.
Oh no, for sure.
Well, I mean, that's not the part that I found odd, I guess. The part I found odd was that he kept on thinking about her as his sister.
Well, I don't know if he thought about her as a sister, but rather he didn't exclude the possibility that she could be his sister.
Right.
Also, I mean, honestly, if you're 15 years old and a woman is going to offer you a hand job, you're probably not going to say no just because you have a sister that you haven't seen in a while. I mean, Japan's a pretty big country.
It is. It's quite dense.
Yeah.
Apparently, hand jobs are just around the corner. But like, what? I mean, what about the fact that she says she has a boyfriend? You know, and then, but she says, like, so you can't touch me.
James, this just goes along with your description of Japan as being this affirmative place where people just want to lend a hand.
They help each other out.
Yeah.
I'm sure her boyfriend would understand.
The passivity that you talked about really only goes along with the men. And this is something, a problem that I have with a lot of Murakami's work, is that the men tend to be weak or passive. Not always, but many of the male characters tend to be weak and passive, whereas the women tend to be much more alive, much more either bubbly like Sakura, or more serious and more focused. I don't know if Miseki is focused per se, but two extremes. Certainly not passive the way the men are.
I think it's interesting that you describe them as feeling alive, because I feel that the women all seem to be mythic creatures. They all seem very unreal, and not very believable.
Well, yeah, that's another problem about Murakami's work. The women tend to be objects. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's the contrast I would draw, is that the men feel very real to me, but passive. And the women have all the agency, but it makes them out to be like witches, for example, or prostitutes, or, they have this kind of uncanny air about them where you feel like this is someone unsafe, perhaps supernatural.
Well, I think that this is something that we'll probably have more chance to experience later on in the novel, but I do agree with what you guys are saying. I don't necessarily think that women in Murakami's fiction are developed in a realistic way, but they are distinct from the male characters in a way that feels artificial. It doesn't match my experience of the distinction between women and men in real life. And I think that it shows something about his worldview as a writer and the kind of world that he wants to present in his fiction.
Yeah, well, my question, I guess, is, we don't have to talk about it we don't have to have the full discussion here, but do you think that women are excluded in his fiction?
I don't know about excluded.
Yeah, excluded is the word that I wouldn't use. I would say that women aren't featured. They're not the center of his fiction the way that men are, but I don't think that, and this is a very, very broad idea, but I don't think that representation needs to happen equally. I think that that's an idea that people have been chasing that is unfair to writers. I think that it's fair for certain writers or certain novels to have their center according to sex or according to race or according to any other factor. And I don't think that representation in one work or even across a writer's entire bibliography needs to be equal in any sense.
I think my main issue here is are the two feminists who come to the library, because you can say that they come to the library as a plot point for Oshima to reveal her or his transgender nature, right? Like, that's the direct result of it. But they come off as being, buffoons, the two women. And it's kind of hard for me to read that section and not read it as an opportunity for the writer to take down some feminists.
No, I absolutely agree. I think that was the most, I hesitate to say it, but probably cringy scene in the novel, because it did seem artificial. It was very much a straw man argument where Murakami had set up these two caricatures of feminist thought in order that he could then dunk on them, Like it wasn't a realistic a realistic depiction of feminist thinking at all. But at the same time, I don't know that it was Murakami's intent, and of course intent is something that we'll never really have access to, but I don't think it was his intent necessarily to disparage feminism, but rather to disparage a certain type of thinking and a certain type of false thinking. I think after that scene, Oshima then goes on to explain why he has a particular distaste for that sort of person. And I don't know if the connection between that type of bad thinking and feminism is necessarily what Murakami wants to make, but rather just a connection between that type of bad thinking and maybe the problems in modern society. That's the connection that Murakami would make. But again, I could definitely see how we could read that scene as Murakami kind of creating a fake version of feminism that he can dismantle in a very flashy way to kind of puff himself up.
Yeah, I mean, I really struggled with it because there aren't really any three-dimensional women in the book, which would be fine if they were also, if those two feminists were also not in the book. It seems to take a step too far when you set up this kind of straw man argument. But that's really my only quibble. So far, so good.
Okay, sounds good. I think maybe we'll come back next time after we finish the end of the novel, and we'll have some more concluding remarks about the whole thing.
Okay. Well, to our listeners, such as they are, thank you for listening, and till then, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.